Hello, with me today, Spring Watch presenter Gillian Burke, who's worked as presenter, director or producer on many other natural history programmes, including most recently the BBC's Blue Planet UK. Gillian is Vice President of the Wildlife Trusts. With her is the sailor Dee Caffari, the first woman ever to sail around the world single-handed, non-stop, and on one occasion the wrong way round, in other words, against the prevailing winds and currents. Dee's memoir is appropriately titled Against the Flow. Gillian Burke, would you start us off with your choice of a good read? What is it?
So I picked a book that I'd finished just towards the end of last year called Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. It truly is a book that I think has shifted my perspective in the way that I think about nature, the way I think about biology, the way I think about the natural world. I'm someone who has spent pretty much all my life, thinking about nature or being part of it and somehow, what we all are, obviously. But this book really was like the game changer in terms of giving me that permission to revisit the way I saw nature.
To simplify, what Robin Wall Kimmerer does in this book is to look at how her Native American ancestors related to nature, the way in which they interacted with animals and plants. And would you say she sort of looks at that as a model of how we should think of interacting with nature now?
I would imagine that's what she is inviting. I would say that one of the things that really struck me is the sense that, yes, she frames that within the context of Native American and ecological knowledge, but actually we all have indigenous roots. At some point in history, we uncouple from that particular way of seeing the world where our lives are really dictated by natural cycles, so natural time versus clock time. So because those are her roots, that's the context of it. But I really felt like there was the opportunity to think about plants without being a botanist, without having the science constraining that thinking.
Dee Caffari, Braiding Sweetgrass. What did you make of it?
I absolutely loved this read, and I just thank you for making me read it. I'm somebody that is quite a slow reader. I have to literally read every word, and it feels like I've watched a movie. And by reading Braiding Sweetgrass, it was like watching multiple episodes of a story unfolding. And I think it was down to the timing. I read this in the period between Christmas and New Year. So I find that time of year quite a reflective time of year. And it just symbolised so much with me. I just resonated with all the stories of that whole being capable of an ability to have gratitude and live with reciprocity. And it was really interesting because my life is focused on the ocean. So I've got a real affinity to the ocean health, and a strong advocate in that direction. But I hadn't really thought about my relationship with the land. And yes, I love walking. I go on my dog walks and I'm aware of the seasonal changes. But I'd never really thought of how that influenced my behaviour and my attitude towards things. So it just gave me a really broad spectrum of actually, what does this mean to me? And it wasn't really identifying with certain plants, but that life cycle and the symbolism behind it all and what it means, and how looking back at indigenous cultures and how actually that basic ability to have gratitude and be thankful for the right things is so important that we can transpose that on our everyday life now, and we'd probably be a much happier society.
I felt it was a very urgent and important book, and one we should be listening to. I mean, its messages are, as you say, Dee, that we need to be grateful for what we've got, for what the earth provides us with, that we need to respect it, the natural world, the non-human world, and understand it. And there's a phrase she repeats a couple of times, which is, take from it only what you need and use everything you take. And I was thinking I should have that as a motto in the kitchen, But much as I enjoyed this book and much as it made me think, there were 2 or 3 occasions when I just said, oh, Robin Wall Kimmerer, really? It's things like when she says, the land loves us. And I think, no, the land does not love us. But what for me is particularly refreshing about this book is that Robin Wall Kimmerer isn't lecturing from some kind of pulpit. You really feel she's down there. She's in the forest. She's looking at the forest floor, walking on the dead leaves, spotting the first wild leeks of spring, or a wonderful section where she's clearing duckweed from a pond, and it's trying to rescue the tadpoles every time she clears out some duckweed and there's a tadpole attached. I mean, it is, Gillian, it's a very sensual, physical book, isn't it?
Yeah, right from the start of the book, she is very careful to identify in crystal clear detail the experience of, say, listening to the sap. Like, she describes right at the beginning tapping the maple trees and listening to the sap, and she gets the noise of the sap, each drop hitting the metal buckets that they use to harvest the sap, this ploink, ploink sound. And so right the way through, she's, I think, really brings alive not just the kind of visual description, but the sounds, sometimes just, tactile as well, the feeling. One of my favorite moments in the whole book is she's in the forest and caught in a sudden downpour. So she finds shelter under a fallen tree trunk. And underneath that is mosses growing. And while she's waiting for this rain to pass on, she starts watching the drops of water winding their way down the individual moss leaves. And then she makes this observation that not all drops are the same. They're different sizes of different types of leaves. And then she has that curiosity of, well, is that an accident of nature, or is there a reason why that would be so? And she goes on to unpack the possible reason why it would be adaptive, why it would actually serve not just the plant, but the kind of surrounding that it lives in, to have these leaves that sort of hand the water drops down to the next leaf, to the next leaf. And I think for me, that was for me the biggest take-home message, was this sense that everything was part of a whole. And I think it was that sense of there's this cooperation and sharing that goes on in the natural world that we sometimes miss. And I could really see that in many examples. So she talks about this gift economy rather than ownership. The whole thing just made me really stop and think again about, even as she describes, well, if she's going to use paper and she actually acknowledges where that comes from, then every word she writes down better count. And I thought, wow, imagine if you looked around your home and thought of everything in that context.
It's exhausting, isn't it, if you think like that? But it is so true. And I think that gift economy was really big for me, the sharing. And sailors are very symbolic people. We give a toast to Neptune as we cross the equator for safe passage. And I think the story that really hit me was the fact that actually man's activity was required in some cases, that without people taking and moving and making space, more couldn't grow. They couldn't get the light and they suffocated themselves. So actually we need to live together, but it's not being too greedy and taking too much.
We've been talking about Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. And to my choice of a good read now, which is a novel, it's called O Caledonia by Elspeth Barker. And although it was published back in 1991, I only read it just a few months ago. And I've kind of fallen in love with it. It opens with a corpse, which is the body of a 16-year-old girl called Janet, who is discovered wearing her mother's black lace evening gown slumped on the staircase in their castle in the Highlands. And this sounds as though it's the opening to an Agatha Christie novel or something of the sort. But actually, it couldn't be further from that. This is the story of Janet, of the girl who at 16 ends up dead. It's the story of her life, Janet being this sort of passionate, romantic, angry, clumsy, frustrated, misunderstood child who loves reading, she loves the countryside, she loves animals, but human beings, including her own family, not so much. She doesn't understand them, they don't understand her. And this is a book that I think it's very dark, it's also very brilliant, and it's heartbreaking, and I find it very funny. And as I say, I've kind of fallen in love with it. Gillian Burke, did you like it even a little bit?
I liked it a lot, actually. Like you, I found it funny pretty much from the get-go, despite the sort of pretty sinister setup. It captured for me that sort of door, sort of Scottish Highlands, the whole atmosphere of it for me was really evocative. Yet that sort of very dry sense of humor where, for example, Janet sort of sees a scene where she realizes that she has no place in it and realizes that she might actually serve it much better if she was a ghost. And then there's that little line at the end. She goes, I can't wait till I'm a ghost. And, those kind of lines were just hilarious. They really had me laugh out loud. There was a point in the book where I started to think, come on, can someone's life really be that relentlessly, that sort of death by 1,000 cuts type of abuse and neglect? But there's no let up right the way through. So hence being very grateful for the humor and the very clever writing, how she writes in that humor without overtly, trying to be funny. And I thought it was a real interesting contrast, actually, to Braiding Sweetgrass, a book that I'd sort of recommended, because it did really hold in stark contrast her experience of the human world, her relationships and the things she observed, and then her relationship and almost the only place she got some respite, which was in nature and her observations of nature. Although even that, the way she describes the sea as oppressive, I thought that was really interesting. The idea that, she was relieved that there was a room that didn't have a view of the sea, which I thought was hilarious because I personally love the ocean, and, the idea of having a sea view room is a great thing. But no, I thought it was brilliant. I really enjoyed it.
Dee Caffari.
Well, I'll contrast with you because I found that a little bit hard to read. It was a dark, tormented childhood of a repressed upbringing and coming of age. And I felt like she never stood a chance. And I started to think then, where did the author get the ideas from? What experience has she had to be able to put this pen to paper? And coming from a teaching background, I was immediately on, what is the child trying to say? And there's a number, especially in the last couple of years, where homeschooling's made children feel isolated and they are feeling alone and don't have that interaction with people and don't know how to interact with people, which was one of Janet's key issues. She just couldn't control how she interacted with people or knew how to. But also I see, separated from their peers during the pandemic, they don't learn. And then the information taken in, a lot of her findings was about death of the animals, or as you say, the scary North Sea crashing the coastline. And it's kind of grey and bleak and very miserable. And I think now that children hear so many bad things about the planet, our futures, the pandemic, and they have this climate anxiety that is actually causing a problem for some children. And I was like, maybe this story, I was just relating this story to how does this affect me now? How am I seeing this resonate now? And I think there is an element of some children needing to have that support network there, or to be recognised so they can have help, because they live this isolated life that Janet led, and she just lost herself into books because that was where she found sense, but she couldn't translate that to real life for her.
I think that's so interesting what you're saying, Dee, and I thought it was even broader than that, and that this is, for me, it was a kind of Gothic representation how so many children and teenagers feel. It may not be actually as extreme as Janet's experience, but I think a lot of us at that age feel misunderstood. I mean, I can remember saying to my parents, "You don't understand me." And I think that's quite common, and particularly for teenagers. And also the obverse of that, which is that you don't really understand the world. I mean, Janet doesn't, as you say, she doesn't get it. She doesn't. There's one point when her mum asks her to bring the baby, and the baby's in a pram. And she's tiny. She's a toddler at this point, is Janet. And instead of just pushing the pram in, which is what her mother expects her to do, she tries to get the baby out and, of course, drops it on the ground and is dragging it. I mean, her younger siblings do not fare well with Janet. But her mother is so frustrated with her, and you can sort of understand. I mean, her mother is not a sympathetic character, but you can sometimes think why a child like Janet might lead you to be rather frustrated, because she just doesn't get what other people seem to pick up on.
And I sensed a lack of support. There wasn't really anyone for her to turn to. Her father was quite an absent father. Her mother didn't relate to her at all, so chose the other siblings over her. It highlighted how cruel people can be, even when they don't know they're acting that way.
But that is the strength of the book, and I guess that's why I enjoyed it. Because there is no let up. There's no moment of lightness in there other than the dark humour. I think what Huxley did really well was capture that experience when you live outside of the kind of dominant worldview, whether that's in your home or in society or nationally. So I thought that it really captured the feeling of being unseen, unheard, unrepresented, but doing it in the context of, that setting gave it that element of relatability, I guess, particularly for a British reader. So for me, that was the value of being put through, having to live, to watch this child grow up. it gave you that opportunity to feel what that must be like.
And as you say, as we all keep saying, does it with such humour. There's a moment when young Janet falls in love with a grey knitted rabbit that's in a village shop somewhere, and she really wants it, and the parents say to her, look, it's not your birthday yet, stop whining on about it. Someone turns up at the house with the grey knitted rabbit, and it is for her new baby sister, and she is just shocked and so upset about it. She takes her younger brother out into the garden where this other baby is lying in a pram. You do not want to be lying in a pram in Janet's household. And she and her brother bury the baby under leaves and earth and everything, and then go back in to Mum and say, this is what Janet says, she says, a nasty rat has buried your baby, she's gone now. And that is both, I found that just so sad. I should say that the baby emerges quite unscathed, as they tend to from Janet's ministrations. But it is that closeness of sadness and horror and humour, I think, that just resonates for me in this book.
Being somebody that reads as if I'm watching a film, it was a very dark humour movie for me, and it didn't really show Scotland off at its best.
Yes, it's not for the Scottish Tourist Board, that's for sure. We've been talking about O Caledonia by Elspeth Barker. I'm Harriett Gilbert. You're listening to A Good Read, where my guests today are Gillian Burke and Dee Caffari. Dee, over to your choice of a good read now. What is it?
My read was Turn the Ship Around by L. David Marquet. And it's a story of how a captain, L. David Marquet himself, turned the US Navy's worst performing nuclear-powered submarine crew into one of the best. Back in 1999, true story, he took command of the USS Santa Fe. And by naval standards, it was right at the bottom of the rankings. And he transformed the demoralised crew into an empowered, motivated fighting force in just a year. But he did it by controversially replacing the military's traditional leader-follower style into a leader-leader model. And it gave the crew members control over their work. They felt empowered. They learned to think and act proactively and determine what needed to be done rather than waiting to be told. And the reason I picked this book is I really enjoyed the read and the lessons I could take from it. And I've tried to implement that in some of the teams I've worked in, of empowering, basically getting the team to a level where your presence is not necessary. So it can all be done without you, but it's a long process to get there. You have to kind of invest so that the reward can come at the end. And I think that everybody can use Marquet's principles in all lines of work, wherever you work and wherever you find yourself. And I think that's why people can identify and resonate with some of the battles he faces and the solutions that he finds are things that you think, oh, I might try that in my life.
You know, this is so curious, Dee, because your most famous feats of courage and skill are solo feats. I mean, you sail around the world on your own. I'm just so interested in the idea you have a team of some sort.
Yes, it still involves a team effort to make it happen. And sometimes then the communication model is even harder because you don't have that face-to-face daily interaction. So you need to put a lot of the foundations in place before you cross the start line and set off on a boat on your own. But then when you are used to having that environment of complete control where everything's within your power, when you go back into a team environment where you're sailing with others on a boat, it's really important that you get that teamwork smooth and you don't be that fly in the ointment that upsets everything because you're so used to doing it yourself.
Gillian Burke, Turn the Ship Around by L. David Marquet. Did you enjoy it? Did you learn from it?
Well, I had a day where I needed to do a trip up to North Devon. I live in Cornwall, so North Devon is up for me. And I thought, great opportunity. I'll load it on the audiobook version and listen to it on the journey. And I am so glad I did, because it's narrated by David Marquet himself, and his voice brought so much to life for me. The atmosphere inside a nuclear-powered submarine is not something I've ever experienced. And even just the conversations when he kind of relayed the way they all talk to each other, he was able to do it in a way that he could own the tone and the kind of the back and forth nature of these like quick, sharp commands. So I found that really fascinating, just purely on the level of being able to kind of have a glimpse into a world I, if I'm honest, hope I never see. But then more than that, what I really took away from it was it took a certain amount of compassion, actually, in order to do what he did. One of the most important things that I took away from that book was he talked about how to not just empower, but emancipate, free people up to become leaders. So I loved that. And then I also loved the fact that he had this way of saying the name of the submarine he captained, the Santa Fe. And he'd go, the Santa Fe. And every time he said it, I could hear the pride in his voice. So he seemed to have this incredible sense of duty, not just to the men that served under him, but also to, as he put it, the American people. And that overrode any consequences he thought he might face, organizational consequences for taking decisions that he thought were good decisions. So I thought it was a really interesting style where he was empowering people to be good leaders, but still keeping the responsibility. And I thought by not being completely in service to the organization, but in service to the people he served, it avoided him getting caught up in that sort of group think that I think a lot of organizations can get stuck in.
I have to say, Dee Caffari, this is absolutely not a book that I would have read unbidden, not least because I've spent my entire life trying to avoid being either a follower or a leader. I'm useless in either role. I try to slip out of it. But having said that, I thought it was very thought-provoking and sensible. And I think, talking about the things that struck home with you, Gillian, with me it was his determination to change the crew's culture from one of anxiously trying to avoid mistakes into one of striving for excellence. And I thought that goes beyond thinking about how you inspire a team. It's something that I thought, not easily done, of course, but I just thought that was such a powerful idea, that his crew was so sort of nervously trying to make sure they didn't do anything wrong that they forgot that what they were trying to do was to be the best, or what L. David Marquet wanted them to be was the best. I mean, it is quite inspirational on lots of levels, isn't it, Dee?
Yeah, and I'm really delighted that you both found, that level that's worked for you, because I think it's a surprise. People, as Gillian said, they go, US military, and your perception of military is very much top down. You get told what to do and you do it to the best of your ability. But they're also trying to expand people's minds to be the best version of themselves at that point doing that job. And I think if we think about our everyday life, it's important to all of us to try and grow as a person, be open. But as you say, the investment he makes to do that shows a huge kind of size of character that he has, to be prepared to go through that process and belief that it can happen, but therefore belief in the people around him so that they feel valued and empowered. And that whole how you treat people is reflected in how they react and how they act themselves. I think is quite a powerful lesson.
Gillian, do you feel that these are lessons that you will actually take away from the book and use in real life? Is any of it applicable to you?
Do you know, it's interesting. It's a great question because my first thought when I saw the title was like, why this book? Why me? Why do I got to read this? It's interesting what you said, Harriet, that you've avoided being a leader and a follower. I've maybe never thought of it that way, but I think I'm like that as well. What I did start to think, and this is going to make you chuckle, is I've got a 15-year-old and a 13-year-old, and I find myself issuing lots of orders all day. And I am genuinely going to try this. I'm going to try and work out how I get them to walk around the house and identify jobs they want to do. And they can come and inform me and they can say, I intend to clean the bathroom. And I can say, very well. Let's see how that works out.
I suspect that the crew of a US submarine are probably more obliging than two teenagers, but I could be wrong. On the other hand, you know what will be very interesting as a parent and as a boss, which is one of the messages in the book, is that bosses always want to be indispensable, really. What everyone wants is when they retire or leave their job is for things to become worse and for everyone to say, oh, it was so much better when Bloggins was here. What Marquet is saying, and it's true, I mean, I'm sure people don't necessarily consciously think that, but I'm pretty sure that most of us think that unconsciously. And he's saying that is absolutely the wrong thing. What you have to do is to make sure that when you leave, even if the next person who comes into your role is useless, the structures and the crew, the people are so well organised and so confident and so used to making decisions that they can even cope with a bad leader. And I think probably there's a message in that for parents as well, that you have to gradually let go and recognise that one day your kids are going to be leading their own lives and making their own mistakes. And, you won't be there the whole time.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I say that with a little bit of a joke, but I do genuinely, it has made me think about how to make sure that they actually can think for themselves, and even in the sort of mundane, things around the home. But beyond that, it's the start, isn't it?
Dee Caffari, with your team, what have you actually done specifically as a result of reading this book?
Well, my most recent round the world, I implemented this to a certain degree, but it was that balance of risk and reward. And the team I took was predominantly under 30, so a very young team without the experience, but were very skilled. But seeing their foundation and their growth in confidence as we went round the world was something that I'm probably most proud of. And actually, I got myself into the position where I didn't know what my role on the boat was, because they were all functioning to the point where I was unnecessary. If I wasn't there, the boat still would have gone. And I was like, I've done a really good job, but now I don't know where I fit in. And actually, I had to have a whole inner dialogue and a little conversation with myself of putting myself back in as part of the process, rather than stepping right back and going, now what do I do?
We've been talking about Turn the Ship Around by L. David Marquet, which is published by Penguin. And before that, we were talking about Elspeth Barker's O Caledonia, which is published by Weidenfeld and Nicholson. And we started by talking about Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, again published by Penguin. For hundreds more book suggestions, search for A Good Read online or via the BBC Sounds app, where you'll find ideas from guests as various as Alan Titchmarsh, Kamala Shamsi, Catherine Granger, Stephen Fry. And if you've read a book we talk about here, tell us what you think of it by joining our book club on Instagram. You can follow us at, all one word, A Good Read BBC. For now, though, a big thank you to my guests, Gillian Burke and Dee Caffari. And to you as always. Thanks for listening.